of the initial thrust of the Oxford movement were poets. That's a very significant piece of information. That's really helpful in assembling the history of this great corrective in the church's life. It's also a harbinger of things to come in what is sometimes called phase 2 of the movement. Here are two staunch university divines hearkening back to biblical, traditional, and theological basics of the Christian church, all the while reading and teaching the works of Wordsworth, Coleridge, John Keats, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and William Blake. Imagine those two things going together. Take a close look at the church's life in the decade that followed Keeble's sermon and see how this paradigm of church shifts from head to heart, from intellect to soul, from the prosaic to the poetic, as Romanticism wins the day, at least for a while, over rationalism. These Romantic poets and artists and architects and sculptors were champions of the aesthetic, the musical, the right brain, the intuitive, the classical, the primitive, and the structured. Harkening back to the olden days with a kind of euphoric recall fueled so many of their efforts. That's an important point. Hold that. Harkening back to the olden days with a kind of euphoric recall fueled so many of their efforts. The pragmatic was out, the sentient, the nostalgic took its place. But heaven forbid, not the emotional, as in emotionalism practiced by the Presbyterians. Feelings were to be of the decent and ordered variety, not of the enthusiastic. Demythologization had had its day. Try to pronounce that sometime. Demythologization had had its day. Now suddenly, an abrupt turn to the numinous, the mysterious, and the transcendent. Tractarianism plus Romanticism equals Oxford movement, and later we begin to call it Anglo-Catholicism as kind of a bridge, a generalization over the whole thing. But it's important to help separate these. Oxford movement, by the 1940s, it is causing a stir, if not a ruckus, in church life. The Oxford Trailblazers were celebrating a good number of successes with their appeal to human sensibilities, so important after rationalization had done the very same. They had even established a foothold, a political party within the shockingly dry and suffocatingly stuffy Anglicanism of the time. And not just across the pond. The news traveled with supersonic speed across the Atlantic. In my own experience as a priest of the church, I daily witnessed this historic upheaval in my workplace. For years, my office at Trinity Church, Wall Street, New York, was housed at St. Paul's Chapel, just a mere 3 blocks up the street. Now known as the little chapel that stood because of its survival just 50 feet from Tower 7 of what was the World Trade Center. And then its significance in 9/11 and the days following. St. Paul's Chapel, built in 1775 to resemble St. Martin's in the Field, and it's almost an exact replica on a smaller scale. St. Paul's is quintessential Georgian architecture. Sunlight flooding through its clear paned glass windows as the illumination of reason dispelled religious myth and superstition. A gigantic pulpit, accessible only through a winding staircase that takes the preacher to soaring heights and homiletical ascendancy. He was able to lord it over the Gentiles. The sacristy, a sacristy in this place the size of a broom closet, indicating something of Eucharistic infrequency, and a little tiny cubbyhole in the sacristy where the minister stored his one and only vestment, a black preaching gown. And finally, a steeple that sports a gigantic clock and a brass weather vane and not a cross. Above the holy table is a stone carving of the Ten Commandments. And like most churches of its ilk, there is a second floor balcony for the overflow crowd of Sunday listeners who came for the 3 to 4 hour sermon. What if I preached to you 3 or 4 hours on Sunday morning? You would be in Asheville before the day was done. The sermon of the time was more frequently than not a perorational discourse on something like the complementarity of science and divinity, and people loved it. Now, walk down Broadway just 3 blocks, and here's Trinity, the mother church, the second oldest congregation in Manhattan, established as an Anglican outpost in 1690, with a constitution of its own borrowed, almost word from word, from St. Mary Le Bow in London. As most of you know, Trinity Church, Wall Street, is a perfect example of neo-Gothic architecture, with its 3-tiered elevation of nave, chancel, and sanctuary, with its enormous stained glass window behind the altar, with its ornately carved pulpit and brass eagle lectern, with its marble altar that never in its history was referred to as a holy table, with its vested choir, chasuble clergy, sandstone exterior, incomparable music, and a baptismal font of such great stature that there's no way on earth that anyone would confuse it with a bird bath. After fires destroyed the first 2 church houses, this edifice was completed in 1848, just 15 years after Keble preached the sermon on national apostasy. Oh, the momentum, my goodness, it was massive. And guess whose body is buried under the high altar at Trinity Church, Wall Street? It's none other than John Henry Hobart, the champion of the high church movement in the early days of the Episcopal Church, and the father-in-law and chief spiritual and theological mentor of Levi Silliman Ives, the 2nd Bishop of North Carolina. The correspondence is amazing here. In the room off the chancel where the clergy and choir gather every Sunday for the great Eucharistic procession, a carved sarcophagus of Hobart takes up half the space of the room. He is magnificently sculpted in coat and mitre, and he looks more like Cardinal Richelieu than the first bishop. I dare say Hobart never saw a coat or mitre. He was a high churchman of the first order, but he was not what was later referred to as a spike. You heard that term before? Spike. That is a pejorative term used for Anglo-Catholics. It referred, first of all, to the little spike that holds the candle. And later, the whole team were called the Spikes. If you call someone Spike, you're going to really get bopped in the head, I assure you. He was a high churchman of the first order, but not a spike, not a ritualist. A whiff of incense or the tinkle of a bell would have sent him over the edge all the way to Quakerdom. But you can see, I think, how historical recollection conflates high church with Tractarianism, with ritualism, and it comes out in this mud bath called Anglo-Catholicism. High church was certainly a term that had been used for some time, way back in the late 17th century was its first usage. It meant strict, rubrical obedience. Pay attention to the rubrics in the Book of Common Prayer. It is common prayer. Because apparently at the time, clergy were doing whatever in the world that they wanted to do. Oh, I wish we had strict rubrical obedience today. They practiced prayer book fidelity, apostolic authority and order, sacramental grace, a clearly distinct threefold order of ministry, bishop, priest, and deacon, although we rarely see a deacon except in transition, and an excessive dose of Anglican superiority. In the latter part of the 18th century, continuing well into the 19th, and even into the here and now, we've had to deal with Anglican pride run riot. and at times a sinful pride, a sophisticated form of nastiness, truly a corrosive thread that has coursed through our ecclesiastical veins for years. And if anything, that's going to be the thing that may do us in. Bishop Butler's famous quotation uttered at some point in the late 17th century is a case in point. Listen to this. Anglicanism stands on the perfect balance between the meretricious gaudiness of the Church of Rome on one hand and the squalid sluttery of the fanatic Protestant converters on the other.